Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to sort of lay the foundation for this one a little bit, especially considering the caliber of speaker that we have on stage and not wanting to assume, any knowledge base from anyone in the room, in the audience. And so I wanted to start with a definition of legacy. Cheryl and I have talked about this a lot, just these amazing ideas. And so would you start us off with
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is actually one of my favorite questions because we created a definition of legacy in response to regulators and legislators not knowing how to fit legacy operators into their social equity structures, into the legal framework. And we started with the legacy operators themselves. So there's a Unified Legacy Operators Council based in New York, and they gave inputs, and then at the Justice Foundation, I kind of wordsmithed it a little bit and pulled in our sacramental use community. So the definition of a legacy operator, and this definition is currently going through ASTM International's balloting process for global adoption, and we're also socializing with every regulator in the country through CANRA, the Cannabis Regulatory Association. So the definition is an individual who has commercialized for the majority of their income or sacramentally distributed or ceremonially distributed cannabis outside of the legal framework during the period of prohibition and predating legalization by at least 5 years. And that's jurisdictionally specific as far as when that clock starts ticking backwards for the 5 years. So that is our definition of legacy operator. Going through the ASTM process, it looks like we might add, instead of an individual, it'll be an individual or house of worship, but that's still being balloted at this time.
Interesting. What do you think about the house of worship?
I'm definitely an advocate for including houses of worship. I am Rastafari. A lot of my advocacy includes including the Rastafari community in the licensing structure through their sacramental use of cannabis and other faiths like the Hindu faith as well. Some Judaic practices include use of cannabis. And then in Christianity, the Yale School of Divinity has looked at cannabis from a ceremonial or sacramental perspective. So I'm an advocate for including houses of worship, and I'd like to see ultimately that impact our distance requirement regulations and legislation so that we remove houses of worship from the distance requirement provisions of statute and regulations, because if you are a house of worship, how can you be distanced from a house of worship?
Good point. Exactly. Really good point. Anything to add to legacy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to me, legacy was the communities I grew up in and the people who raised me. I earned my first dollar in cannabis 39 years ago, trimming for my mom. And so legacy cannabis was as diverse as we hope that regulated cannabis can become, which was communities that were, my mom was a gay female, single mom. And so, legacy to me is the people I knew, the regions I grew up in, Mendocino, the Emerald Triangle, communities that my definition isn't quite as granular as hers with as many, qualifiers. It's just people who operated before there was a paradigm established by others. And so for us in California, that would be prior to 1996 when SB 420 was passed. So anybody who operated before 1996. And even when things pass, there needs to be more time before it's actually implemented. But anybody who has pre-medical experience, to me, in California is legacy. And for me, it wasn't individuals. It was families. It was communities. It was entire regions where the school needed to be built. Those communities, those families, that cannabis income supported those regions.
I'll just add to that and say that an important part of my definition as well, and as your definition, is the fact that we make a clear distinction between legacy operators and gray market participants. Gray market participants are seen by communities at this point as being a nuisance, and there are clear distinctions on how they operate versus how legacy has traditionally operated. Overall, our strategy is to free the plant. we don't discriminate, but we do want to make sure that it's clear that, the legacy operators, they preserve the genetics. They took this significant risk of losing their children, of being incarcerated, of being beaten by law enforcement and things like that. So that's why we make that distinction as far as from a policy perspective. We're ultimately striving for a priority for legacy operators as well as amnesty for legacy operators.
We'll definitely get to all that. Does the Med have any sort of formal definition of legacy or just a way that they approach it?
Sure. So in Colorado, in the Marijuana Enforcement Division, the agency I oversee, I really appreciated just what was shared here, like Cheryl's description, because when I think about legacy operator, it's just, and how we may speak about it, it's just at a very high level or broadly, in that, somebody who's operating outside of the legal framework, but the level of precision that Cheryl and Yarrow touched on, I think are important in thinking about even the period of time during which we're looking at who is a legacy operator when you tie in the word legacy, and as opposed to the, gray market operation. And so with this description, I could see this tying into as we established a social equity program, we began to stand it up in 2021, 2022, and we have a definition for a social equity licensee that is, there are similarities in that, and it tying into somebody who over a period of time or in specific years, and focusing on those years that were tied to, what is known as the war on drugs. And so looking at that time period, if somebody lived in certain designated areas, and I know other states have done something similar, a disproportionate impacted area, that's one of the elements or criteria that we look at for who could be designated as a social equity licensee.
Right, yeah, that moves us into my next question, which was sort of, how do you define equity, right? And then, what obstacles are you experiencing in defining or redefining that in cannabis. And so that segues us actually perfectly, kind of balances legacy and equity, puts them a little bit on a scale, which is kind of an interesting approach. Do you have a definition of equity?
Absolutely, I do. I didn't memorize it the same way I memorized the legacy operator one, but as the chair of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Subcommittee for ASTM, we are just starting to roll out our standards for the balloting process. So there are 4 standards that are currently going through balloting. As I mentioned, the legacy operator one, but the first standards that were actually developed were a definition for diversity, a definition for equity, and a definition for inclusion. So you will be able to contact ASTM, get access to these formal definitions for local adoption of these policies. So when you're talking about equity, it's really looking at opportunity, and then it's also looking at the removal of bias or discrimination. So when we're talking about equity, it's making sure that we level the playing field, that there's equal opportunity for people to participate, specifically in the cannabis industry. And it may even have some remedial or the ability to remedy harm that was previously done when you're looking at equity. And when you tie equity in in terminology such as social equity, a lot of social equity frameworks are designed to remedy harm that was previously done. So we want to make sure people have the opportunity to participate in a way that not only levels the playing field, but in some cases it may remedy the harm done by incarceration or the ineffective distribution of resources where these communities are concerned.
Yeah, you got
I mean,
2 cents? You got 2 cents about everything.
Yeah, on this one, it might be 2.5 cents. So I'm a verified social equity applicant myself. Went to the wrong schools, grew up in the wrong neighborhoods, and got in the right trouble. And I have cannabis felonies in my teens, my 20s, my 40s. I've never gotten in trouble for anything else, but apparently I never learned my lesson with this industry, and especially growing up in a family that was already a cultivation family. And in California anyway, I think that the definition of social equity. I mean, I can't speak for the whole country. I know we're in Washington, D.C., but in California, there would be no cannabis industry if there wasn't black culture, brown labor, and gay men dying of AIDS. And so the beginning of social equity was communities and constituents that were now trying to get back into regulating cannabis that really innovated cannabis, and that's why we have this regulated cannabis industry. We were very careful around not wanting to have a definition of social equity that was removed from the lessons learned with affirmative action, where we saw rollbacks in some of those programs because they were defined in terms of those immutable characteristics like race and color of your skin. And so we came up with things like disproportionately impacted areas. And that worked really well for urban environments, and it doesn't translate for agrarian and rural communities. And so there's this massive disconnect. And the other thing also is that, when we talk about, at least in California, black and brown, because you can't really lie with the facts that prohibition was inherently a racist tool and disproportionately impacted communities of color and communities of poverty. But in that conversation, at least in the first couple chapters, got lost a little bit of the indigenous communities and the things that were done to people who lived on reservations. And so, so like, when I think of social equity, I think of color, region, income, and then there are little outliers like me, like a Jewish kid who grew up in a Hispanic neighborhood. And so, I've had an opportunity to practice more allyship and leadership in some of these conversations because I might not necessarily look like what everybody thinks social equity looks like. I can tell you one thing: when you're Jewish, you're white to people of color, but you're not white to people who are white. And so you don't know what that looks like until you go to prison for the plant, and you don't know who you're supposed to run with because you're not black and you're not brown, and the white people are all swastika up, and it's like, where do you go? And so, but and that's not to say anybody's suffering or disenfranchised is worse than anybody else's, but there are communities that bore the brunt of prohibition, and I think it makes a lot of sense that those constituents have a head start now. And as much of a head start as we can offer, and a head start that's commensurate with the taxes y'all are levying against the industry, and looking at the funds that are available for social equity programs, whether it's grant funds to operators or technical assistance and third-party, know-how that's being provided to these new cannabis entrepreneurs. But let's make sure that those grant funds are robust. Let's make sure that we're supporting this industry in the way that many industries have gotten government support. And let's make sure that those grant funds at least are expressed as a ratio of the taxes that are brought in, because right now it's a little bit of a drop in the bucket. But to me, social equity is, it looks like what America looks like. It's black, it's brown, it's indigenous, and it's people who are not necessarily rich. And, I think those communities deserve to really have a first mover advantage in newly regulated markets. And it's not an entitlement program. Think of it more as like a stepping stone towards some reparations. This is the greatest country in the world, but it's the greatest country in the world because we can criticize it openly. And so I think that we need to think about the history of this country and the history of social equity through the lens of women finally being able to vote, civil rights in the 60s, people finally getting to marry who they love. And now, these communities that were decimated by asset forfeiture and by the breaking up of families. I mean, we say that it was a war on drugs, but it wasn't a war on drugs. It was a war on people. And those people had families, and those families were decimated. And so, I can go one step further in saying that, when we talk about expungement, you never get back your Second Amendment right. Open carry was not pioneered by some white guy in Texas with a "Don't Tread on Me" flag. It was actually the Black Panthers in the late 60s in Berkeley. And so when you take away people's right, you're disarming communities, and you're taking away providers and parents.
I have a slightly different approach to equity. I want to caution us that we don't look at equity from too broad of a lens. It does not turn on wealth. To be clear, it does not turn on wealth. When we talk about communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs or the criminalization of cannabis, it does turn on access to resources but it's not specific to wealth. So I want to make sure that, we can, if we define it too broadly, then who's not equity, right? The war on drugs, I strongly believe that it was a war on black and brown people. I have people who may look white, but their last name is Torres, and once they got pulled over, then they got a different type of treatment. I think when you enter the court system, being of certain ethnic groups specific to black and brown community, you're treated different when you go through the court system. Access to resources affects your ability to get legal counsel, and that goes beyond cannabis. So I just want to make sure that we're very clear here when we're looking at social equity, and every state defines it differently. So there are some key core areas that we look at. We've already gotten kind of a slap back on looking at race from certain jurisdictions. We've gotten the slap back at looking at residency in certain jurisdictions. But we really need to be vigilant in making sure that when we're talking about equity, we're talking about the communities that were harmed. Categories that are more popular amongst states with regards to social equity include, and I'll use New York as an example. So you have your, sometimes they'll try to approach it from a minority women owned business perspective. Sometimes they'll look at distressed farmers, which, a distressed farmer can be of any ethnicity, but we really can go back in history and factually assess the harm that was done to those individuals, or we're trying to repair the fact that they've struggled in the past. And that may be tied to economics more so than harm. Looking at people who have been institutionalized or been incarcerated, that makes sense. And then looking at our veteran community. So it really needs to have a rational cause and effect with regards to the tie-in to this period of prohibition. And I believe that strongly, and I think we can make a very strong argument based on statistics and of 90% of plus arrests are Black and Hispanic males, that there's a reason why they were arrested, that they were incarcerated, that their sentences were longer, and now that we have this robust, lucrative industry that has been created, there is a need for us to kind of go back and take care of a little bit of repair. So I just wanted to, stress the fact that when we're talking about harm, this harm, it wasn't beautiful. It's an ugly part of American history, and we are the ones who are in the seats that can make the difference and make sure our future never looks like that again.
I'm going to jump in on this as well, because this has been a particular challenge for the state of Colorado. As many know, when we stood up our program at the beginning with Amendment 64 and the legislation that came out of that, one of the areas included naturally eligibility criteria, and there's an area of our statute that provides it's persons prohibited to be issued a license. So it's prohibited persons, and there's a criminal history portion of that. And at the very beginning of our program, this immediately cut out a whole lot of people to be able to participate, and that it had a 5 and a 10-year prohibition from the date of a conviction. And it was, if it involved a controlled substance, then you were prohibited from that point, from the date of the conviction, from applying for a license, or you would be denied. And this has since evolved and changed. It's no longer making that distinction about a controlled substance. There is still a criminal history prohibition. It's a flat 3 years for felonies. But with that, there's also been challenges. And I know at the beginning of the program, Shanita Penny had touched on, she referred to a course correct. And it's really difficult to do that at this stage in Colorado. There's a lot of work that we still have to do and will continue to do. There are now dedicated resources on this subject for us to continue to make this progress in collaboration with stakeholders. But to course correct when there are already so many participants in the market, there are challenges right now in the market. this will require a lot of problem solving for us, and that includes looking at things like what we see some other states and local jurisdictions doing on reserving certain license categories only for those designated as social equity designated licensees. So we want to continue to do that. Another item I wanted to touch on is that this is oftentimes established in statute through that legislative process rather than our rulemaking authority. Just from what I heard, it's having me think about, to what extent can we look to find some adjustments, but recognizing as regulators, we're not always trusted by stakeholders, and the General Assembly is ultimately in that role of directing a policy that we're implementing. But I could see a lot of value in providing us as the regulatory body a broader authority to be able to adjust what is a social equity licensee based on conversations like this so that we can continue to refine what that looks like. And I do see issues with some areas of the eligibility criteria for the social equity program that could be so broad that folks are coming in and being found eligible and approved based on what's in statute. And we hear from stakeholders saying, that's not who we anticipated would be a part of this program. And so we're sort of caught in the middle in some of these conversations that become a challenge. So I could see some real value in having some rulemaking authority for us to be able to adjust as we learn.
I want to just jump in one thing. It's really, really challenging to have a broad definition of social equity when social equity can look so different from area to area, region to region. And the challenge that I've seen in allowing local municipalities or regulators to come up with their own definitions of social equity and to give them that sort of regional flexibility is just that they don't have a social equity program and that they don't end up doing it. And so I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all definition, but even with massive amount of grant money available at a state level, we're still in California aren't able to get these cannabis programs to bolt on a social equity component to their regulatory paradigm. And the sad thing, at least in some of these markets, is that social equity isn't being built into the front. It's sort of like an asterisk afterwards, like an yeah, okay, great, we'll add that. And so there doesn't provide a first mover advantage. And, like for example, in San Francisco, where I have a cannabis distribution permit, my social equity status gave me permit processing priority. And so that means it only takes a few years instead of a few years plus another year. If the glacial pace of entitlements doesn't really get people to the market to be able to participate as regulated businesses, then the priority that you think is providing an advantage is almost like not even real. And so I do think that ideally social equity does have the ability to have some local and regional differences. And I would personally rather see more people qualify than less, just because I'd rather see, we want a criminal justice system where occasionally a guilty person goes free, not where an innocent person becomes guilty. And I would rather see programs that are a little broader. I've seen programs that I thought were a little ill-advised. Some where they said, well, if you've been the victim of sexual trafficking, because we do have some issues with unregulated businesses, but it was that's a really hard one to kind of prove. And I understood where it was coming from, but does then everybody just go, yeah, I was a victim and I'll show you on the dog where they touched me? How are we supposed to track that? The other thing that was really difficult was this arrest record thing, because a lot of the enforcement that happened, say, in the Emerald Triangle, people didn't have records of that. And if they were arrested, they would have a record. But if they were enforced against and not arrested, if they were just handcuffed for 6 hours on the porch while everything was decimated, and then they were released, they didn't have those arrest records. Or they had these interdisciplinary task forces that would go around, but they wouldn't always arrest people. So it was really hard for people to show receipts, so to speak. And so that, I think, goes back to that need to have sort of regions that have been acknowledged to just, disproportionately impacted regions, and why people could qualify based on residency.
And I think that's why the definition of legacy operator is really important, because, with it turning on an arrest versus a conviction, someone with a possession charge who was, buying, and again, the war on drugs was horrible for a lot of people, but those individuals who were out there distributing, risking robberies, risking loss of their kids by being consistently distributors of cannabis. Those are the people that if we created a pyramid or a tiered system, we should, even if we're at the lower part of the pyramid, we should be happy to see the people that took the most risk get the benefit first, or get the benefit instead of someone who, like Warren, drugs sucked for everybody, but I wasn't out there every single day trapping. So I think that's why definitions are really important for our regulators and our legislators, so that they can start giving priority for certain benefits based on the degree and the level of harm.
Right, so the intersection of equity and legacy being, sort of what it is, it's complicated, right?
It
And I
is.
think it's something that belongs, I do believe, belongs in more regulatory hands, right, than maybe a legislator's hands. I do. Maybe not local control, right, completely, but, because we love the local control in California, right?
Little inefficient.
But speaking of regulators, right, and their powers, right, like how proactive should they be when we're talking about sort of overseeing the contracts that legacy and or social equity are engaging in with potential investors, or like, the money people? I mean, how much oversight, how much engagement should the regulators have? I'd like to start with Dominique, because obviously as a regulator up here, I'll put you on the hot seat first, but that's a really hot button question these days.
It is, and it's quite a challenge from the regulatory perspective, and in with our later in the game approach and initiative around social equity. We, and tying into the predatory practices that we can see. Our social equity program includes what's referred to as an accelerator program, sometimes compared to an incubator type program, but this has involved so a new entrant, somebody who's a designated social equity licensee, could then partner with an existing business, an existing industry member, who would then provide various types of support. It could be funding, it could be the location that either a separate location or allowing for this social equity licensee to operate on their premises. And one of the big challenges here is we didn't see a whole lot of participation from the existing industry who had been operating for some time. And so we needed to broaden that and make sure that there was also a pathway, and recognizing not everybody who's designated social equity needs or wants that sort of support, and wants to just operate their own business like any other business and have those the variety of options. And so that our program also does provide for that pathway to just apply for and operate your own business. And we still need to work through providing various incentives and other support. And so we haven't, because there has been such a lack of participation in that accelerator program, that's really where we were having more conversations, and we were engaging in the rulemaking process around what is our role as a regulator when there's some disagreement or some issue with the contract or something that appears to be predatory in nature. We were really struggling, and the whole stakeholder group we had was really struggling with that. And so there's still a lot to learn there, but I think some of it comes into play when we are preparing, say, when it comes to agreements between parties as a part of the social equity program. Are there certain requirements or templates, things that we can provide that help get ahead of those sort of issues? And also some form of, even if it doesn't involve an enforcement action, some form of accountability when we are engaging in any sort of inspection or investigation. What other questions are we asking for purposes of that accountability and transparency, and what are we potentially reporting out on these things to make it more clear, or potentially putting somebody on blast if there's something that unusual that's going on. And it's a matter of, though, of that transparency that we would want to lay out structure ahead of time so that everyone's clear on what our role is between the parties and what is essentially a contract dispute.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in. The state of New Jersey, when they were rolling out the CRC, they were rolling out their program they came up with a standard of review, which I think is a best practice, which I think other states have adopted since, which includes, first they're going to look at criminal history as mentioned, and with the criminal history, it works both ways, right? So it impacts the social equity, but it also that helps you identify disqualifying offenses. So in legislation, in regulations, usually there are some disqualifying offenses that the state says, you know what, you're money launderer, we're not giving you a cannabis license or something like that. Looking at the criminal history is the first bucket. The second bucket is looking at the experiential piece. So your education, your narrative about who you are, what you've done in this industry before, who's a part of your team, et cetera, and so on. Then there's the social equity bucket, which ties into the criminal. But as we mentioned, there are very priority categories by state. And that fourth bucket they identified had to do with ownership and control. And we also see in the state of Connecticut really tight ownership and control provisions, which ultimately led to a lawsuit or 8 lawsuits, or maybe 1 lawsuit or 2. But there was definitely discontent with how they approached the ownership and control, and it was perceived they were overly involved, and I think they settled and came to a happy medium on what makes sense and giving another opportunity to revise. But ownership and control is very important. In past years, dealing with social equity clients, and a lot of times I get them too late, and I'm not a litigator either, so I get these clients who, they never had a lawyer review their contracts. They are the black and brown face of this team that as soon as everything's signed, their treatment changes, their visibility to documents and how we're progressing in the process changes. I have had a client where, she signed an operating agreement, never got any type of compensation for a license that she owned 100% of, where she now owns 7% of the license, just because she trusted this is our lawyer, right? So I think there is a responsibility of government to be involved with ownership and control reviews, or providing resources for these equity applicants to have legal support, legal counsel as they're engaging in these partnerships and relationships. There's so many sad stories with regards to ownership and control issues. I've seen operating agreements where, again, I instruct my justice fellows, the people I support, you initial every single page of any document you sign, because the pages change. The percentage that they sign is not the percentage submitted to the state or the percentage that they use when there's any types of discrepancies. So these predatory practices are real, and they devastate individuals, they devastate families, and they causes distrust of government. These are people, when you're talking about the legacy operator, they're people who have never, from their experience, has never gotten anything positive from government ever. Government is their violator most of the time. So when they're in this position to surface, talk about their legacy experience, knowing that we don't have amnesty at a federal level or a state level, they're taking a risk. And then as a result of that, there aren't protections from them. They are re-victimized by a legal process. And I think there is a certain amount of responsibility that governments need to take, whether it's the reviews happening by government and them making a determination. I can understand why that's uncomfortable for a regulator. But if it's providing through their technical assistance programs and other programming support, so these individuals, before they get into these relationships with potential predatory investors or just shady individuals, providing them to have the ability to have legal counsel to walk them through the process, I think is the right thing to do. I think it's an honorable thing to do. And I think that's where we need to go in the future. And the Justice Foundation, that's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a conversation with Nicole Elliott when she was still at the San Francisco Office of Cannabis, and we were discussing, certain paternalistic regulations and certain predatory practices in the industry. And it birthed a whole pro bono legal services project that now is in full operation in San Francisco. I mean, she and I looked at each other and we said, well, let's do this. And so we did it, and Shay Gilmore helped launched this program. It has made, I think, a big difference in a lot of the social equity applicants in San Francisco. At one point, we had some regulators in that office that were really adamant about reviewing contracts and stopping them if they looked predatory or, pushing back on clauses that they weren't comfortable approving. But that's not always the case. It really kind of depends on the license analyst that you receive. So it's been really helpful, I think, to have just that pro bono panel. So I'd encourage anybody who has the power, who will work with the local regulator, to start a pro bono panel. There are a number of attorneys in this room, I'm sure, who have access to that power. And I think it is our responsibility, particularly as practitioners in natural medicines, to really take up that torch. I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in there. But Yara, you definitely have something to say. I can just see it. It's like on that tip of your tongue.
I mean, look, the government went from spending 6 figures to lock me up for selling cannabis to giving me 6 figures to sell cannabis.
Somebody.
And there's something really poetic about that.
Yeah.
And the grant funding that they provided is certainly, it's better to get a kiss on the lips than a kick in the teeth. And so I'm happy for that. I'm also like to think I'm a little bit sophisticated, like I'll go for the Grey Poupon instead of the French's mustard. But the truth is, when it comes to these contracts, like, you're only as good as your lawyer, really. Because, like, I don't know what all these words mean, and I can read them, and I understand English as my first language. But I was really, really grateful that the Office of Cannabis, where I was getting my permit, did review those contracts, that their job wasn't to be thirsty and hungry and excited about being in regulated cannabis like I was, that their job was to have some oversight and say, that doesn't pass the sniff test. And I was really, really grateful that they looked at that. Given how long it takes to get permits anyway, it didn't feel like it was adding a bunch of extra time. And I was like, yes, please and thank you. I think that the place where, and I think it's really difficult because on the one hand, I feel like we need support, and that's resources. And on the other hand, I've seen the way in which restrictions on dilution have the opposite effect on social equity cannabis operators. And diluting and getting capital in, and capital being able to have control or a majority interest because they're putting gazillion dollars in. Like, I think there's a reasonable capitalistic capital argument that has to make sense. And what I've seen is that, like, the unintended consequence where, moneyed interests won't participate in social equity markets because they can't get the control they want. But then there's these, intelligent attorneys who differentiate between equity position and profit share and all of these other things. And like, at the end of the day, the only thing that really bothered me was, like, the restrictions on when I could sell the business. Because initially that was 10 years. And, like, I don't know if you guys can see from there, but I already have gray hair. Like, what if I don't want to run a business for 10 years? What if selling out is the new keeping it real? What if I want to, not everybody's going to create generational wealth. I don't want to buy an island. I might just want to buy a vacation. And so there was some well-intended stuff that I still feel like kind of jammed us up. And so I appreciated them looking at the contracts. I appreciated the idea that there were people who were kind of just tasked with making sure that we didn't get taken advantage of. I didn't appreciate some of the dilution restrictions and how long I would have to own a business. And I would love it.
That was actually the conversation that sparked the pro bono thing.
It's really challenging.
Was that 10 years?
I would love it also when we talk about resources, like, everything is almost good at the beginning of the formation of the contract. But what about the divorce, or what about the separation, or what does that look like? And so, like, the place that I think I could see social equity applicants really benefiting from additional government involvement is if there is a dispute later on. Because typically disputes are measured by how much money is at stake and who can spend the most to litigate. And that's never going to be the people I run with and the people who are up against the wall because maybe they backed themselves into an agreement, maybe they didn't understand what it meant, or maybe they just don't have the enforcement ability when somebody is not, conforming with whatever the four corners of that document said they were going to do. And so I would love it if there was a fast track for dispute resolution that prioritized social equity, that didn't mean that that there was an additional barrier to entry for us to be able to get some third party sort of, people looking and going, wait, that's not what it says, or you didn't do what you said you were going to do. That would be great. I think that that would be wonderful. And really, the dilution thing is the thing where I would love to come up here with some beautiful new way to do this. But, like, how do you let money come in and money to feel comfortable in an arranged marriage while still having control, but allowing for dilution, allowing for exits. It's not easy, and unfortunately, it's scared a lot of money away from social equity markets. And the truth is, having social equity people involved in cannabis businesses is like one of the most valuable things you can do for a cannabis business. Because most of them know a heck of a lot more than you're ever going to learn at Amsterdam, Greenflower, and wherever else you're trying to get your education. And so they bring so much value that I don't know that a lot of outside interests are totally appreciative yet of how much value most of these legacy folks in these social equity communities can really bring to a cannabis business.
Thanks. And I just want to highlight a couple things as well related to this. In our social equity program, we did build in some elements around, forward-looking provisions of if you're entering into this partnership with a social equity licensee, let's already talk about and contemplate what happens if there is a change of ownership, if there is an exit, if you for whatever reason decide you do not want to work together any longer. Let's talk about what those expectations are now and have that documented, and then that's where we as a regulator can step in, and you're going to have to go through us if you're going to change ownership, and so we do have a role in that. Similarly is looking at, those, and other states have done this, equity plans or variations of what this has been referred to, but rather than, as a regulator say, well, this is a private dispute, contract dispute, so it's out of our jurisdiction, we can't help you. What can we do? What steps can we take on that? And rather than perhaps intervening on a dispute based on a contract between two private parties, is also looking at what promises are participants making to us as a regulator? And that's something then we can enforce if we see you did not fulfill that, and have a role there. We do also we recently partnered, and we're doing more of this, partnering with local jurisdictions, and we held an Equity Opportunities Conference where we partnered with different organizations, the Colorado Bar Association, other groups to come in, and Denver hosted us, and it was on a Saturday, and we just had anyone come in and able to, engage with folks and look at services that are available. So we definitely want to do more of that, as well as we have what's referred to as CPOG. It's a Social Equity Advisory Work Group. It's a group that we stood up in 2022 and have regular meetings on to help stay on top of issues and problem solve with stakeholders and help prioritize what actions we should be focused on around this. And then one final quick note is Cheryl had mentioned the experience of how it can be re-traumatizing for some folks, and how we as regulators or other government representatives are engaging with prospective or social equity licensees. And with the Marijuana Enforcement Division, we have consistently had every director has been a law enforcement officer. I'm the first who is not walking around with a gun on my hip, so maybe that helps as well.
In the final minutes, that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit, and I'm glad you actually said that on the stage, because I wanted to talk a little bit about where enforcement's going and how it's transitioning, where maybe it should be going. What's the rate of change in enforcement against illicit activity that continues? So say now we've talked about how to potentially, what legacy and equity are and how to potentially pull them in and support them a little bit in some ways. And there's so much to talk about on these topics, but when we talk about that enforcement, I guess even in the licensed arena and then in the unlicensed arenas, what are we seeing happening? Are we seeing things change? I loved the fact that you were the first law enforcement at the Met. That was great, because even the name of your division is problematic, I would say, or at least maybe discouraging to certain people in the community. So I'd love for people to talk about that. We have about 15 minutes left. This is just fun. There's so much information, but
I'll jump in. I just want to finish my one last thought with the last question, you were fantastic as far as making that perfect segue. So speaking of enforcement, I want us to kind of broaden our view and enforcement against predatory behavior. So we're going to talk about that. Perfect. So I just wanted to highlight that, predatory behaviors are not just, between partners. There's predatory municipalities that we need to really consider, as lawyers. We encounter them when we have our enthusiastic clients who want to get into municipalities, and it seems like, because they're not getting paid a certain amount, or because they're being lobbied by people who lost at the Capitol, they're not letting our clients get in. So there's predatory municipalities, there are predatory real estate, there's a lot of predatory behaviors in real estate, and still redlining exists in 2023. There are even people who want to give pro bono services to, the Justice Foundation. I have to be very cautious because they may just want to give pro bono hours so that they can match these legacy operators or these social equity people with their people who are their paying clients of wealth. We encounter that all the time. Predatory behaviors between my justice fellows, where there's certain fellows that you want to, highlight as ambassadors, but then all of a sudden you see this individual, not every time we do an intro, we'll do an introduction, and all of a sudden they're part of their company, the other person's company. That doesn't smell right to me. I didn't introduce you for that. You were supposed to encourage them to get involved, but not for you to become partners with these different individuals who are making that decision to surface. So I think when we talk about enforcement, I want us to expand our view of it, and there should be enforcement with regards to these predatory behaviors, and there should be penalties, especially at the municipality level and the real estate level for predatory behaviors. Now, when it comes to enforcement, I like it to talk in terms of best practices. So I think what you're doing in Colorado with regards to the last question, those are all, we should be taking notes. Those are all best practices with regards to ownership and control and mitigating predatory practices. We in New York, we have a founding director of Cannabis NYC, Dashida Dawson. We've been doing advocacy work for a long time. She also founded the Cannabis Regulators of Color, and the way she's approached the enforcement and in her new role is, the first layer is really facilitation. So we should be facilitating people getting into the market. I even think that our gray market actors should be facilitated in, but do they take priority over equity? That's where I have an issue. I think we should facilitate everyone being able to participate in the market. So I agree with her there. And then the next step is rehabilitation. So people who are consistently, still acting in the illicit market, figuring out how can we rehabilitate this person. And then the last tier is the enforcement tier. So I just want to share that as you're talking to regulators, and that's an approach that can work. What would you do from a facilitation perspective as a first step? What would you do from rehabilitation for these consistent offenders? And then, again, we don't want to arrest people unless absolutely necessary, and their offenses are extremely egregious because we don't want a second war on drugs. What does enforcement look like in terms of, fines, and, even New York has been approaching, how do we address this with landlords? How do we penalize landlords? So I think that three-tier system for me is a best practice, and I had to give credit where credit was due to Dashida Dawson.
I'm just gonna jump in.
Yeah,
So,
it's out of- it's over
when we
here.
talk about enforcement, when you said that you were the first person in your position that didn't carry a gun on their waist, I was happy and sad at the same time. I was happy because I'm pleasantly surprised at how much I agree with you. And I was sad that we are that far into regulating cannabis in a very established, mature market. And that if we look at the percentage of staff in these enforcement divisions that come from law enforcement, it says everything. You can't spend decades being trained tactically in how to break down doors and secure potential suspects, and then expect that those people are going to have a Cal OSHA lens or become an agronomist. And so, in my area, the people who went into enforcing civil cannabis regulations were former FBI agents and police officers. And the uniform changed, but the culture didn't. And then we wonder why we're trying to mend between operator and regulator. And it's, show me your team. Show me what their CV is, and I'll tell you where you might want to, consider changing your staffing to be able to change that conversation.
Right, but are we seeing any of that change in staffing right now? I mean, are there any communities that we can identify?
I think we could serve as an example, and I also have to give credit to my former boss, the former director, Jim Burak, who is law enforcement, but really looked at things that with such a broad and with a perspective about, is this, where are the issues of public safety with every question he would have, but with also a thoughtful policy approach, not just that law enforcement lens with his breadth of experience, but we have evolved as an agency significantly. I joined the Marijuana Enforcement Division, and yes, the name is a challenge, I recognize, and we have talked about that before. It would be a statutory change, but maybe for a later session. But with our organization, when I first came in 2014, we primarily had law enforcement, so criminal investigators. We had some compliance investigators and a lot of licensing folks. And today we have more compliance investigators. We do, our law enforcement staff still serve a very important role. We coordinate with local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and that link in being able to provide information or get information is very helpful in addressing certain things that may be happening outside of the regulated market, where we can say this person is licensed or not. But we also have now scientists. We need to keep up with all the innovation with products and other, and we oversee testing laboratories. And so we have a team of scientists now, I'm really excited to say, and we have a data analytics team. We have become very data-driven, and we're continuing to build on that. We have a dashboard on our website that provides interactive information over multiple years, so you can see things like prices, license information, and just a wealth of information there. We continue to evolve on that front. And we're also, with that shift, have seen, while we have field investigators that are both criminal investigators and compliance investigators, we are also leveraging things like, as we develop internal tools to do certain inspections, like when we stood up the home delivery program, one of our criminal investigators developed a checklist, and I collaborated with him on this. And as soon as it was completed, it was for their use. And we talked about, let's make this public facing. Why wouldn't we, if it's ultimately supporting a culture of compliance and getting us to a place that we're not reactive and then waiting for something bad to happen that we're reacting to, and then having to take some more strict enforcement action, as opposed to proactively going out, engaging with industry members, informing on best practices, providing more tools like checklists that help get ahead of issues and ahead of harms. And so that has, I think, taken us a long way.
If I may, I think one of the greatest challenges regulators have moving forward is not regulating cannabis, but regulating psychotropic or intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids. And we have members like Pamela Epstein somewhere in the audience who are having this conversation. But I think that the biggest challenge the cannabis industry has is the portion that is cannabinoids that are not created with cannabis, but with hemp, and the lack of regulation over there. And I think that's one of the greatest threats.
Right, Delta 8 enforcement, the Delta 8 of the world, right? As they like to say. Yeah, I get a lot of alerts because I track all the cannabis legislation in California. And one of the ones that, always surprises me is they always amend, who can carry firearms in California. And every time I open that one bill and I'm looking at, who's being added, I always see the Department of Cannabis Control on there. They carry firearms when they go and inspect or knock on the door of a licensee. So there is that issue, but there's also enforcement, and we just have a couple minutes left, against those like the Delta 8, Delta 10, or the unregulated cannabinoid market, and just illicit grows. Like how do regulators balance that? Like where should the focus be? Should it be on trying to help a licensee who's gone through all of the steps to, get into the regulated market, and help them foster their business, or should it be somewhere else? I guess, and Sherry, you have a.
I'll just say, a couple things. So much to unpack there.
Right.
One on the
Sorry.
guns thing, really quickly. We do need to be cognizant of the fact that there are certain markets that are more gun friendly. So, Texas, everybody has a gun. Florida, everybody has a gun. But then when we're looking at these charges, having cannabis and a gun, it's seen as a violent offense, right? So I think there's some work that we need to do there where it's like, it's our culture to have a gun. Doesn't mean this person was going to do anything with the gun, but everyone has a gun. But that resulted in increased sentencing with regards to that. And then the other part of your question was about Delta.
Enforcement against unregulated or unlicensed operators, right? As a mechanism to assist people who have undergone the hardship of getting
I
licensed.
completely disagree with that. I think, no, not completely. I know that's, there's a responsibility, but a market will do what a market does. And I think we allow people to cower under this, you're supposed to hand us a market in a nice, pretty red bow. We have that issue with our cultivators in New York where they're like, we can't sell our product because you haven't opened enough stores. But I know people who went to your farm. I know multiple people who went to their farm, and they're not going to buy it, even no matter how many competitors or how few competitors. They're never going to buy your stuff. So we are just rocking you to sleep where you think you're going to ever sell that product because it's not good product. Go back and educate yourself on how to make a good product. So I think it's so unfair that we're trying to cuddle people when it's really have great customer service, have great product quality, have a great sales team, marketing. Go back to the basics. There's tons of water options, and we all have our favorite. So you may never ever sell that product that you have until you go back and really make a good product. Work on your customer service, customer experience strategy, work on your marketing strategy. Doesn't matter how many smoke shops are out on the street, you're still not going to sell that product if you're just sitting there in your store waiting for people to come in and you want everybody else shut down around you.
Or let Northern California ship the good stuff to your neighborhoods.
We have good haze and sour diesel in New York. We have great ganja in Jamaica. So.
For sure. So do you have any closing words on that issue at all? Or you want to let that one go?
I'll just, one other final element, I was going to say, get your Colorado weed, but now I'm not going to say it. Is how we engage it, with law enforcement staff. How are they being trained? And because we are responsible for training them, is that your standard law enforcement training, use of force training is a requirement? And how are we setting up scenarios? And I have seen it live, and it is about how our law enforcement staff supporting if there is a burglary, if there is somebody, if something bad is happening, and it's ultimately with almost that protective sense of, as opposed to enforcement from that law enforcement perspective against licensees. And so that's another evolution.
That's very good. All right, well, I want to say thank you so much to my amazing panel, and I'm sure there's a ton we didn't get to. You can see that.